Welcome to Storyflix. In this video, we will explain Bubble Boy. Bubble Boy tells the story of a man who was born without an immune system and started living life inside a physical bubble. When he learns that the girl whom he loves is about to get married, he builds a portable bubble to get to her. Will he reunite with his dream girl? Let's find out on Bubble Boy. The film begins by showing a baby named Jimmy who has to live in a closed room to avoid viruses and bacteria. Jimmy was sentenced to have a weak immune system. When he was 4 years old, his parents took Jimmy home and cared for him at home. Jimmy was put in a special bubble to avoid the dirty air around him. In his bedroom, there is a large plastic balloon equipped with giant gloves. Through these gloves, Jimmy can interact with people outside the bubble. When in the house, Jimmy always carries his giant bubble. Mrs. Livingston is a protective mother. She does not allow Jimmy to make friends with the children around their home because she believes they carry a dangerous virus. One day, Jimmy accidentally saw a girl who had just moved next door. The girl's name is Chloe. That's when Jimmy immediately fell in love with Chloe. He was also seen busy cleaning his bedroom window so he could see Chloe from a distance. Realizing that Jimmy often looked at her, Chloe finally decided to visit Jimmy's house. When she got to his room, Chloe was confused when seeing Jimmy live in a giant bubble. Jimmy was so fascinated to see Chloe. But Mrs. Livingston came and asked Chloe to leave. Mrs. Livingston is also seen cleaning Jimmy's plastic bubble while forbidding Jimmy to see Chloe again. But it turned out that Chloe was back in Jimmy's room the next day. She even brought a guitar and played the guitar while singing with Jimmy. Since then, Jimmy and Chloe's relationship has grown closer. One night, a drunk Chloe sneaks back into Jimmy's room. It turns out it was Chloe's birthday and she wanted to celebrate it with Jimmy. Chloe also said if she wished Jimmy to give her a gift in the form of a kiss. Unfortunately, their worlds are separated by the giant plastic bubble. At that time, Jimmy felt the growing love for Chloe even more. But he couldn't reveal his feeling because he was trapped in the balloon. But Jimmy's heart is broken when he finds out that Chloe is dating a school friend named Mark. Jimmy could only see Chloe and Mark from the bedroom window. One day, Chloe came back to meet Jimmy. But this time, Chloe brings news that instantly breaks Jimmy's heart. It turns out that Chloe will marry Mark soon. Their wedding reception will be held at the edge of Niagara Falls. A heartbroken Jimmy finally asks Chloe to leave and never see him again. He looked very disappointed. Before leaving, Chloe gave him a gift box. There is a glass ball with a miniature that looks like the two of them. It says "I love you." A sentence that means a lot to Jimmy. Now Jimmy spends his time sad because he can't express his feelings for Chloe. Finally, Jimmy was determined to see Chloe. But he was still trapped in the giant balloon. Chloe is getting married in 3 days and he doesn't have much time. Finally, Jimmy managed to design a balloon that he can use like wearing clothes. With the balloon, Jimmy can get out of his house and find Chloe. This was for the first time in his life he was able to get out of the house even though he was still in a balloon. At first, Jimmy intended to take the bus to Niagara Falls, but he didn't have enough money. Finally, he continued his journey on foot. But Jimmy did not realize if there was a bus that was speeding and hit him. Fortunately, the balloon saved him. The bus then stopped and came a group of people wearing the same clothes. Jimmy asked if he could ride with them to Niagara Falls. The people also agreed to take Jimmy. Inside the bus, it was seen that the people were so excited and singing. Jimmy also really enjoyed his time with them. It turned out that they were on their way to a desert for a meeting. They said that they are a group of people who have now left worldly life. They are studying with someone named Jill, the head of their association. Jimmy said that they were following a cult. Hurt by Jimmy's words, they immediately threw him off the bus and left him alone in the desert. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston were shocked to find their son not home. The two immediately decided to look for Jimmy and arrived at the bus stop. The bus conductor said Jimmy was taken by a group of young people who were on their way to Las Vegas. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston immediately went to Las Vegas to find their son. Jimmy, who walked for hours in his balloon, finally met a motorcycle gang named Slim. At that time, Slim's motorcycle broke down because of a punctured tire. Jimmy then helped Slim patch his motorcycle tires. Jimmy told Slim that a group of a sect had just dumped him in the wilderness. Hearing the story of Jimmy, who was chasing his love, Slim was moved. Slim tells the story of his past, that his lover left him as well. He even tattooed her nickname on his stomach. Because they have a similar love story, Slim finally decides to take Jimmy to Niagara Falls. Meanwhile, the sect people had already arrived at their meeting place. Their leader named Gil shows an ancient stone carving that shows the shape of their god. It turned out that their god was trapped in a giant balloon, and they had to save him by freeing him from the balloon. They then realized their big mistake for kicking Jimmy out of their bus. They did not think that Jimmy was their god. Jimmy and Slim eventually become best friends. Slim took Jimmy to Las Vegas on his motorbike. Slim, who ran out of money, ended up stopping by a casino to gamble. He intended to earn money so he could buy gas. Slim then left Jimmy with a coin. Amazingly, Jimmy managed to win the grand prize by using the coin, which was a scooter equipped with an engine. Feeling Slim has been gambling too long, Jimmy finally decides to go to Niagara Falls by riding the scooter he just won. Slim, who lost Jimmy, panicked and tried to find him. That's when he met a bus containing many young people wearing the same uniform. Slim remembered Jimmy's story and was angry with those people on the bus. But Slim did not expect that they would run over his motorbike to ruin it. Meanwhile, Jimmy, who was riding his scooter, met his parents. He then tried to avoid them, but he was hit by the car, so he bounced and got into a train carriage. Jimmy, who had fainted, woke up the next day. He was so surprised because there were so many strange-looking people around him. It turned out that the train was filled with circus performers under the leadership of Dr. Freak, who was a dwarf. But Dr. Freak is not a nice person. He continues to bully Jimmy until an angry Jimmy immediately pushes him hard. Dr. Freak bounced and passed out. Finally, Jimmy managed to free the circus performers from the crazy Dr. Freak. Jimmy continued his journey and stopped at a diner. There was an Indian man named Push Pop who was being bullied a lot by the people there. Jimmy was angry and threw the people away. A sheriff walks into the diner and thinks Jimmy is a patient who has run away from the hospital. Everyone panicked because they thought Jimmy was carrying a dangerous virus. They ran away and made a fuss that caused the restaurant to catch fire. Luckily, Jimmy was helped by Push Pop and took him into his ice cream truck. Push Pop decides to take Jimmy to Niagara Falls. However, due to falling asleep while driving, Push Pop accidentally hit a cow in the middle of the road. Push Pop was hysterical because, in his belief, cows are sacred creatures and should not be killed. Jimmy saw Push Pop sad, then decided to go on foot towards his final destination. Mr. and Mrs. Livingston finally meet with Dr. Freak and they work together to find Jimmy's whereabouts. The biker gang meets Push Pop, who is still mourning the cow's death. Push Pop asks Slim and all his friends to get some ice cream in his truck. While the motorcycle gangs were having fun eating ice cream, the sect people bus came again. They didn't even hesitate to hit all the motorbikes parked on the side of the road. On the other hand, Jimmy finally arrived at a town close to Niagara Falls. He decided to take a taxi, but he had no money. Jimmy then entered a wrestling contest and managed to win the match. He came out with enough money to take a taxi, but he met with the cult group again, which immediately kidnapped Jimmy to a narrow alley. They are now ready to free their god from the shackles of the giant balloon. Fortunately, the circus group saw Jimmy and they tried to help him. Meanwhile, Slim and his friends hitch a ride in an ice cream truck. Finally, they arrived at Jimmy's place. Motorcycle gangs, cult groups, and circus humans meet. When the group finally got into a fistfight, Jimmy managed to escape and took a taxi to Niagara Falls. But the old taxi driver fell asleep while driving until Jimmy was thrown and hit a billboard. Jimmy couldn't stay still because Chloe was getting married soon. So he boarded a speeding plane. Meanwhile, Slim accidentally crashes into Mrs. Livingston's car. And who would have guessed that Wildfire, Slim's ideal woman, was Mrs. Livingston? On the other hand, Jimmy's plane was damaged, so he fell into the river. It turns out he had arrived at Niagara Falls. With determination, Jimmy forced himself to get to Chloe's wedding reception. When he arrived, Jimmy immediately opened the plastic balloon. Because of his love, Jimmy was even willing to die out of his protective balloon to kiss Chloe. After kissing Chloe, Jimmy fell unconscious. Mrs. Livingston, who realized that her son had passed out, was so sad. But strangely, Jimmy suddenly woke up from his stupor and he turned out to be okay. Mrs. Livingston admitted that she had been lying to Jimmy all this time. So protective, she tried to lock Jimmy in the house to protect her son. Finally, Chloe did not marry Mark and chose Jimmy. At his wedding reception, everyone who had met Jimmy on his way to Niagara Falls came. Now the followers of the sect are followers of Push Pop's faith. Meanwhile, Dr. Freak becomes a good circus leader, and Slim had become good friends with Mr. and Mrs. Livingston. Jimmy and Chloe then live happily ever after.